Live from Quito, Ecuador, I'm Sony Gray and this is From the South, the evening news brief from Tell Us Your English. We start this new edition right now. Brazil's labor reform, a central pillar of President Michel Temer's policy, will go into effect this Saturday. Trade unions and other groups are holding protests across Brazil to try and block it. The government argues that reform is needed to bring Brazil's labor laws into line with modern negotiating practices. But the unions say the new legislation will strip workers of the basic rights they've enjoyed for more than 70 years. They also say it risks worsening unemployment, which already affects over 13 million Brazilians. Our correspondent in Sao Paulo, Ignacio Limas, has the details.
Saludos, estudios. Nos encontramos en este momento
en la We're in Plaza da Sé Square in downtown Sao Paulo, one of the 24 cities where protests are taking place to demand the immediate suspension of Michel Temer's labor reform that will go into effect from tomorrow. This represents a 50-year rollback for workers in terms of labor rights, because now employers will be the ones who decide on holiday periods, lunch hours, and the number of working hours. That's the reason why they're here protesting, but also against several other measures, like the planned pension reform, which raises the pension age, and also other policies of the Temer government. For example, the freeze on public spending for the next 20 years, especially in health and education services. These are all measures to reduce public spending, which the unelected government is pushing ahead, even while its own popularity has plummeted to just 3%. That's why unions and social movements are protesting against these government measures.
Ignacio Limas in Sao Paulo. Hurricanes Irma and Maria cut a path of destruction through the Caribbean, where for many countries tourism is the main economic driver. So let's look at some figures from the Caribbean Tourism Organization. It says that this year's violently active hurricane season has reduced flights to Puerto Rico by 25%. Flights to Dominica are down 13.7%. Those to St. Martin and Anguilla have fallen by 12% and just over 6% respectively. Earlier, we spoke to the former Bahamian Tourism Minister, Vincent Vanderpool Wallace, to find out what's the current state of the industry right now in the Caribbean. Let's hear what he said.
35 destinations in the Caribbean. So you talk about 7 that were affected to any degree. So by and large, you find that the Caribbean is open for business almost everywhere. And I'm a member of the board of the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association now. I really focused on making sure that we let the world know that the Caribbean, by and large, is open for business, and those 7 destinations that were hit to any significant degree, they're on their way back, and you will find that even some of the statistics you presented earlier, they're beginning to increase in terms of flights coming back into the destination. And the one thing we've been very proud of is the number of destinations who have not been affected have been raising funds and providing assistance to those who were affected. So we're getting back up to speed quite rapidly.
The message out of the 45th meeting of the Council for Trade and Economic Development, COTED, is that the Caribbean needs to have a coordinated approach to economic development. During her opening remarks, COTED Chair, Trinidad and Tobago's Trade Minister, Paula Gopi-Schoon, said the region must focus on diversification and they must move in tandem with each other to improve freedom of movement and the region's service and technology sectors.
The meetings of the COTED are significant given that the Council was established to assist the Conference of Heads of Government and the Community Council of Ministers with the trade and economic development issues of the region. This mandate of the COTED must be pursued vigorously as the region struggles to survive and achieve sustainable economic growth and development in a turbulent global economy. As small economies, we must embrace the role of the COTED as stated under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. We must aim to deepen the CARICOM single market and economy to realize the full benefits of the treaty.
Cubans have been reacting to the new U.S. measures to tighten its blockade on the island, which came into effect on Thursday. Details in this report.
Ismael Perez is showing tourists the delights of colonial Havana, just as the Trump administration's new sanctions against Cuba come into effect. In the coming months, North Americans could disappear from these groups of tourists traveling the island.
This prevents us from showing U.S. citizens that there's nothing to be afraid of when they come here. A lot of them are afraid because what the U.S. media say about us, that we're a terrorist country, and when they come to Cuba, they realize it's quite the contrary.
The Cuban government believes that these new measures will harm U.S. businessmen. They'll lose out on the opportunities that currently exist here, and the Cuban economy will also suffer, both the private and state sectors.
These measures by President Trump confirm the serious setback in our bilateral relations. They imply a strengthening on the blockage. These measures don't hide their political intentions, like the one encouraging travelers to carry out certain activities to justify their visit to Cuba.
During almost 6 decades of revolution, hostility has rarely been absent from Washington's policies towards Havana. So the latest tightening of the blockade doesn't seem to surprise many Cubans.
They're trying to go backwards. These are old measures, a policy that will definitely not work. They're totally out of date, but that's how imperialism works.
Among the 180 Cuban entities facing new restrictions, there are hotels, social organizations, and even soft drink brands and photographic services.
We have more news in a minute, so stay with us. Public sector workers in Peru are on the 23rd day of their strike against government policies. They are demanding an improvement in their working conditions and salaries. Leading the strike are the school and university workers who claim that their salaries are the lowest in the public sector. Our correspondent in Lima, Jaime Herrera, has more.
We're in Plaza San Martin in downtown Lima. Today marks 26 days of the National School and University Administrative Workers' Strike. They're certain they earn very low wages. They even call them miserable because the minimum salary isn't even enough to live. They can barely survive. Here we have one of their leaders, José Delgado, who will let us know about the workers' struggle.
The school and university administrative workers have been on strike since October 19th. We've been on the streets for 26 days because we earn the lowest salaries of all administrative public workers. We've even found salaries that are lower than the minimum, making us the poorest sector. We demand that the president increases our salaries, that we are granted 10 minimum salaries as compensation for obtaining a tenure. He just receives $1,600. This is an abuse and an offense to workers. We are asking that this year we receive what's been taken away from us.
This is not the only sector that is protesting. The Central Workers Federation of Peru will summon all of the groups and movements to discuss the poor conditions of the worker sector in Peru. Then a national strike will be announced, which will include all public and private sectors.
Jaime Herrera with that report. The Venezuelan government and the opposition will attempt to resume dialogue in this year's third effort to break a political stalemate. After walking away from talks in September, the opposition says it's willing to rejoin the dialogue. They say they want guarantees ahead of the presidential elections scheduled for 2018. Over the last few days in Guatemala, indigenous movements and campesinos have been protesting against hydroelectric and mining projects. Social leaders have also warned that if the demands of the indigenous people are not listened to, the current conflict could worsen.
Another day of protests in the Guatemalan capital, but this time in front of the Congress. The Altiplano Campesino Committee joined the demonstrations in the last few days to reject the hydroelectric projects. They affirm that the political class of the country doesn't care about social interests.
They respond to powerful people, to businessmen and oligarchs, to landowners, and they don't really care about the development or initiatives in favor of the people. We believe it's important to make this known and to try and make a change in the state.
Other protests are taking place in the northern state of Alta Verapaz, but outside the Constitutional Court, people are speaking out and saying, in the region, several villages have been left without access to water from the Cajabon River because of extraction projects that have diverted it, something they say is not benefiting the people living there.
Those families taking over the natural resources are the only ones growing financially. They are becoming more wealthy every day here in Guatemala, even when there's more poverty every day.
This week's protests in the country were a subject of analysis in the Forum Campesino Life, the postponed debate. Social and indigenous leaders agreed the claims from the indigenous people are not being listened to by the authorities, and at the same time, thousands are still living under extreme poverty.
There's
a historic abandonment record in this country, which can be seen more in the lands, but it can also be seen in the work conditions, because to this day, there's still some levels of slavery in some farms and agricultural lands in this country.
Campesino and indigenous organizations that have been protesting over the last few days were not spoken to or contacted by any governmental authorities, so they've been announced new protests before the end of this year.
A student from a teacher's college in Ayotzinapa was shot by Mexican police as they tried to quell a protest that has lasted 3 days, according to witnesses. The student belongs to the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College in Guerrero, the same school that 3 years ago saw the disappearance of 43 students in one of the country's most serious cases of human rights violations. Teachers of the National Coordination of Education Workers also joined the protest to demand that the government rebuild schools and universities affected by the earthquake on September 19th. Mexican indigenous people are gathering in the capital, demanding an increased budget for social programs, as well as a housing plan for the communities that were affected by the earthquakes that hit the states of Oaxaca and Chiapas.
Poverty and the lack of support by the government are two problems that indigenous people continue to face, and it has forced them to leave their communities and go to Mexico City to demand their rights.
Indigenous people are being forced to come to Los Pinos, the presidential residence, to demand that the president stops the discrimination against us. We have the right for health, education, roads and electricity.
During this year, the National Commission for the Development of Indigenous Peoples had their $800 million budget cut, funds that are now needed to face the damage and destruction caused by the earthquakes in September in Chiapas and Oaxaca.
It's a very important issue because indigenous communities are already being marginalized. They don't have resources. If they were poor before, now with these natural events, their lives are full of misery.
Social organizations have spoken out against the government and have accused them of trying to impose a reconstruction model that does not meet the people's needs.
They're tearing down traditional houses, so companies that already agree with the government may get in and start building from zero. We're against this. They're trying to impose a new model that doesn't bond with our culture.
The earthquake that struck on September the 7th left more than 300,000 people affected and at least 63,000 houses damaged in southern Mexico. The government support is not enough to meet the needs after the magnitude 8.2 earthquake and the 10,000 aftershocks.
Bolivian President Evo Morales has met Pablo Iglesias, Secretary General of Spain's PODEMOS party, at the government palace in La Paz. Accompanied by the Committee of PODEMOS, Iglesias was decorated with a Parliamentary Order of Democratic Merit for his vocation of service to society. During the meeting, Iglesias gave football fan Morales a Ronaldo shirt, and the president reciprocated with a number of books, including one of the president's favorites, The Book of the Sea. Colombian authorities have confirmed that 4 people were killed and 20 others are still missing after a mudslide swept through the town of Corinto earlier this week. Families and rescuers have been searching desperately through the mud-plastered rubble for victims of the flooding. Heavy rainfall caused a surge of mud and water to overflow from the Pila River and crash down onto the town on Tuesday, where at least 37 homes were destroyed.
It's hard to be in this situation, with the house like this. It's completely flooded. There's no way to live here, so we are waiting for aid from the state, hoping that they will do something for us, because we are left with nothing, and we need help to continue living here.
Women's groups from various parts of Honduras have been marching to demand justice for the many cases of femicide reported daily in the country.
Leaders and representatives from social organizations took to streets to pressure the government of Juan Orlando Hernández to put an end to impunity in the murder of women.
Rights are not being respected, and there is no real justice regarding the murder of the women in our country.
The president has to fix this situation if he wants to be re-elected.
More than 400 cases of femicide are recorded every year in Honduras. More than 90% of these go unpunished.
We are here today to ask for justice and respect for the life of women. We want to denounce the sexual assaults and other types of violence that we have to endure, and the violence that politicians and business groups direct against our movement.
These women organizations say there is no will from the state to prevent and sanction domestic violence.
Around 20,000 cases of domestic violence are registered each year. In Honduras, we only have 2 courts that specialize in domestic violence. The government won't do anything to increase the number of these courts. The only thing they do is give more money to the armed forces.
The women who came from different parts of the country also complain about poverty, unemployment, and violence.
We, the working women, suffer discrimination if we are ill.
We are seeing hundreds of women die because of the levels of violence in our country, and nothing ever happens. We want justice.
According to the National Institute of Statistics, only 36% of women have a job, although 40% of women are responsible of their households.
And we'll be back very soon, so stay with us. British prosecutors have admitted deleting crucial emails about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, who continues to be holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. Correspondence between the Crown Protection Service and its Swedish counterparts was deleted just 1 week before a scheduled tribunal hearing in London. The CPS lawyer involved in the email deletion retired in 2014, and it emerged that he allegedly advised the Swedes in 2010 or 2011 not to visit London to interview Assange. The U.S. President Donald Trump has sent a strong message to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit taking place in Vietnam. Trump said his country will not tolerate chronic trade abuse and insisted on fair and equal policies. He added that the U.S. is ready to sign bilateral agreements with the countries of the Indo-Pacific region, but on the basis of mutual respect.
I do not blame China or any other country, of which there are many, for taking advantage of the United States on trade. If their representatives are able to get away with it, they are just doing their jobs. I wish previous administrations in my country saw what was happening and did something about it. I will make bilateral trade agreements with any Indo-Pacific nation that wants to be our partner and that will abide by the principles of fair and reciprocal trade. What we will no longer do is enter into large agreements that tie our hands, surrender our sovereignty, and make meaningful enforcement practically impossible.
speaking at the opening of the summit, the Chinese President Xi Jinping defended globalization, saying the world must work to make it more balanced and inclusive.
China's steps toward openness won't stop. We will work together with various countries to push forward construction of the Belt and Road Initiative and increase motivation for joint development. We will implement policies for high-quality liberalization of trade and investment. We will implement a system for pre-establishment of national treatment of a negative list across the board, significantly ease market access, further open the service sector, and protect our legitimate rights and interests.
Our reporter Isidora Diaz has the latest development from the APEC forum that's underway in Vietnam.
The
ASEAN Pacific Forum has already started in Da Nang, in the center of Vietnam. There, leaders of the 21 member countries are discussing the challenge the region has to improve trade. Today, the US President Donald Trump talked belligerently against North Korea and its nuclear program, an attitude that doesn't surprise anyone. In terms of economy, he attacked the World Trade Organization and announced Washington would only cooperate with APEC members that agree with Trump's view on what are fair agreements. He said his country suffers from chronic trade abuses and criticized former U.S. government's trade policies, which, according to him, cost the jobs of millions of U.S. citizens. On the other hand, China's President Xi Jinping once again defended globalization, integration, free trade, and the improvement of international economic structures, the complete opposite of the U.S. stand, and which was acclaimed by all the members at the APEC forum. There are other important points on the table. The three Latin American countries, Chile, Mexico, and Peru, are defending, along with 8 other members, the revival of the TPP. The TPP was signed in 2016, but it lost its impact after U.S. abandoned it with Trump. This time, under the name of TPP-11, important economies in the region, like Japan, are looking to strengthen the agreement. Stay tuned for more developments as the forum ends tomorrow in this city of Da Nang in Vietnam.
With that report. More than 300 Filipino activists protested against the visit of President Donald Trump to the Philippines outside the U.S. Embassy in Manila. The protesters threw black paint at images of Trump and his Philippine counterpart, Rodrigo Duterte, and also burned a mural of the two presidents. The U.S. president is set to meet Southeast Asian leaders and attend the ASEAN summit on the final leg of his 5-country Asia tour. Meanwhile, Filipino President Rodrigo Duterte was in Vietnam giving a speech in defense of his war on drugs, in which he admitted killing someone when he was 16.
When I was a teenager, I had been in and out of jail, rumble here and there. At the age of 16, I already killed someone. A real person. Had rumbled, stabbed. That was when I was 16, and it was just by looking at each other. What more that I'm now a president?
The Speaker of the dissolved Catalan Parliament has been released from jail after his supporters paid her bail. Our correspondent in Madrid, Vincent Montagut, has the details.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. Saludos a todos desde Madrid. Pues sí.
The ousted president of the Catalan parliament, Carmen Forcadell, has been released from an Alcalameco jail a little after 2:30 p.m. She posted bail by paying 150,000 euros, the amount the judge imposed to allow her to go free. The Catalonia National Assembly, one of the 2 most important secessionist organizations, confirmed that the cash came entirely from its own accounts, specifically from a so-called resistance reserve that receives voluntary contributions from citizens committed to the cause. This resistance reserve will also be used next week to pay 25,000 euros of bail, which the judge also imposed on 4 members of the parliament. All of them have been able to avoid jail for 2 main reasons. They complied with Madrid's application of Article 155, and they abandoned their unilateral action to achieve the independence of Catalonia. The prosecutor said the risk of them escaping has been greatly reduced, as well as the chance of them incurring in criminal acts again.
De Cataluña y porque renunciaron.
Good in Madrid. And now let's take a look at the stories making headlines around the world.
In Lebanon, Hezbollah have released a statement declaring that the country's prime minister is being detained in Saudi Arabia and that his recent surprise resignation was forced. Hassan Nasrallah declared that they will not acknowledge the resignation as legitimate, saying that Riyadh's actions are politically motivated and intended to destabilize Lebanon. Zayed Hariri's party also released a statement to call for their leader's return to Beirut and, according to Lebanese officials, are prepared to work with foreign states to secure his return. Microsoft's president, Brad Smith, has said that the world needs a new digital Geneva Convention and called on governments to act. This during a United Nations conference that took place in Switzerland. The tech company official proposed to set a number of global rules for cyber attacks. Cyber attacks have increasingly been used in recent years by governments to achieve foreign policy or national security objectives.
The world needs a new digital Geneva Convention. It needs new rules of the road. What we need, we believe, is an approach that governments will adopt that says they will not attack civilians in times of peace.
Pope Francis has strongly criticized nuclear weapons and said that the world should condemn their possible use and their very possession. The appeal came during a two-day conference on nuclear disarmament that brought together 11 Nobel Peace Prize winners, United Nations and NATO officials to discuss the prospect of a world free of nuclear weapons.
We can't help but feel a deep sense of unease if we also take into account the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental effects of any employment of nuclear devices. Therefore, if we also take into account the risk of an accidental detonation as a result of error of any kind, the threat of the use as well as their very possession is to be firmly condemned.
Thousands of workers in Athens protested outside Parliament against the government's reform policies that plan to change the strike legislation, making it harder for people to protest. Workers also demanded their wages be protected, a higher minimum wage, and the end of property repossessions from owners who could not pay bad loans. Greece is going through a third review of its economic reforms by its creditors to access further financial aid as part of a bailout programme that expires in 2018.
We've come to the end of this evening's news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on our website, tellusyourtv.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for Tell Us Your English. I am Soini Gray. Thank you so much for watching.